Hello everyone, Nathan P. Butler here, and this is another ranking of Star Wars stuff here on the channel, providing more content now that From the Star Wars Home Video Library has slowed down without much in the way of Star Wars home video releases being put out at this point. Now this is the third of these. We've done plenty of other ones on From the Star Wars Home Video Library, but it was all Star Wars home video related stuff. This is sort of generalized Star Wars, and in this case we're going to be looking at the live-action television series for Star Wars. We looked at the animated series that are not Lego-based in the previous ranking. Before that, it was the various theatrical films, live-action and otherwise, because we did include Clone Wars within that. This time we're taking a look at the Star Wars TV series and ranking them from 8 down to number 1. Now, because of the nature of this, because there just haven't been very many of them, when it comes to any series that have multiple seasons, each season is being treated separately. I'm also referring to these as TV productions, so we are going to be talking about things like the Ewok telemovies, which in the US were television specials, not theatrical like they were in some other regions. That's why they weren't on the theatrical release list back when I did that one originally. Now, this is all opinion stuff. The whole point is to just say, hey, this is my opinion, this is how I would rank them personally, here is why. But by nature, because it is opinion, many people will probably disagree. It's opinion. That's how this kind of thing works. So feel free to share your rankings down in the comments, or your comments on my rankings and your thoughts on any of this stuff, but please be civil in doing so. People tend to get up in arms when top whatever lists don't match their exact top whatever lists of their own, especially number ones, and get testy on the internet as if people's opinions are supposed to match. That's not what opinions do. Get a grip if you are someone like that. If you can't handle that, go watch something else. So, let's take a look here at the Star Wars live-action TV productions in my own sort of ranking order from 8 down to 1. Again, treating different seasons of same shows as separate entities. So we start out here with the one that of course is going to be at the bottom of the list, number 8, which is, the Star Wars Holiday Special. The Star Wars Holiday Special is hot garbage. What could be said about the Star Wars Holiday Special that has not already been said about how absolutely horrid it was? I still find it frustrating that it has not been released on home video ever officially, though the faithful Wookiee cartoon from it has been multiple times physically and digitally. I do think that from a Star Wars historical preservation standpoint, it really should get a release at some point, but I'm not holding my breath that that's ever going to happen outside of just bootlegs and scans and stuff like that. But it was just bad. The story was very dull, not a whole lot to it. The characterizations weren't all that great. The characters didn't even quite look like themselves in some cases, like Luke, who looked more like Mary Lou Retton at the time. Google that from the Olympics back then. I guess a little bit later. And then you have all these different variety segments that are just kind of dumb. You have the weird, very kind of creepy, softcore virtual reality Wookiee porn thing that Itchy watches. And a lot of the dialogue is in non-translated Shriwook. Just didn't work. Did not work. The animated clip, that got an honorable mention in our animated stuff in the last of these rankings here, but that in and of itself is not enough to save the Star Wars Holiday Special. It does get the bottom of these rankings here. That brings us to number 7, and you can probably guess what 7 and 6 are probably going to be. Because, Star Wars storytelling has gotten more serious, more mature, more action-packed, more focused in recent years. So you can probably figure that it's going to be the stuff that's before the Disney Plus era that is probably going to wind up near the bottom of the list. And you would be right. So we had the Star Wars Holiday Special first. The question here really is of 7 and 6, which is going to be which, right? Yeah, so for number 7 for me, it is the Ewok Adventure, also known as Caravan of Courage and Ewok Adventure, depending on what region you're looking at the releases from. But Caravan of Courage, the first of the Ewok telemovies. It was an interesting attempt at bringing Star Wars to TV. But how do you do that without a big budget? Well, you got all these Ewok costumes, you got the Force where you're not going to need a lot of effects. Let's just do that. It gave us an interesting tale. It definitely played out better than the Ewoks cartoons, because that was basically Star Wars in name only, as we saw back in the last episode. Like a Swino would be how you would say that. A Swino or Swino. Star Wars in name only. But, this is the one that had sort of introduced a bit more about the elements of how sort of the Ewoks use the Force as magic and that sort of thing, which was kind of cool, which also played off into the cartoon series and whatnot. We had the introduction of Sindel, who was very, very young at the time, and Mace, the Tawanis, not Mace Windu, and their family. Stop motion, I guess, animation at different points. I mean, it was a solid attempt at bringing it to TV for what the time period was. But when you watch it compared to, say, watching the films or watching anything that came later, it definitely feels the most dated and the most kiddie of the two of the Ewok TV specials. It's not one that I typically would want to rewatch repeatedly or anything like that. And the Ewok films in general do have the whole issue of, well, okay, depending on when these are meant to take place, and they've shifted around in the timeline a few times over the years, but given that these were meant to take place prior to Return of the Jedi, at least in their final eventual placement, it does seem odd, for instance, that they're not, interacting with the characters in Return of the Jedi in quite the same way as they're able to interact with the Tawanis and so on. So, yeah, not a great one, not a terrible one, but definitely, you can tell that it's the growing pains of just throwing something out there and trying to do something and labeling it as Star Wars, when really it could have been almost anything else, but the fact that it's the Ewoks and not some other, bear people makes it Star Wars. Okay, fine. That then brings us to number 6, which unsurprisingly is the other Ewok film. Definitely the first 3 of these, not particularly surprising, I don't think. And that is Ewoks: The Battle for Endor. I put this over the other Ewok film. It doesn't have as many human characters really in it to be sort of our connective characters. Sindel is there, a little bit older at this point. The family is basically wiped out early on, but you've got Noah, who comes in as sort of the grandfatherly figure and whatnot, but just feels like a much more focused episode in terms of here are the villains who are relatable and understandable as these humanoid Sannyasin marauders. Charl being kind of the weird magic user that we eventually get retconned to be a Night Sister and all. It's just a much more focused story. The peril feels more focused. The enemy feels more focused. The stakes feel higher after some deaths that happen early on. And it's definitely... I don't know if it's made... I guess to some degree it's made more palatable by the relationship between Noah and Sindel and that interaction, as opposed to between Mace and Sindel back in the original. But that could just be because Mace and Sindel were both played by relatively young actors, whereas, Noah is Wilford Diabetes Brimley. So a very established actor, and Sindel, the actress, is a bit older. I think Aubrey Miller is a little bit older at that point. So it just plays out better. The visual quality is better compared to the first one. It's just the next step, the next evolution of the Ewok telemovies. It definitely has more staying power to my mind than Caravan of Courage did. Though, of course, with no Caravan of Courage, you wouldn't have had a Battle for Endor. So, whatever. And, Battle for Endor, Battle of Endor can be confusing to some, but hopefully nobody's confusing Return of the Jedi with an Ewok telemovie. That then brings us to the top 5, which could have been their own list of top 5 Disney Plus Star Wars TV series seasons, at least for live action, because that's basically what it winds up being here. All the stuff on Disney Plus, to me, is better in production and better storytelling, more enjoyable Star Wars stuff than what we got with the Ewok telemovies or Holiday Special. That should probably be a given. The question here is, in what order will they fall? Again, doing season by season by season as far as these goes, which really only makes a difference for Mandalorian that has had 2 separate seasons so far. We start out with number 5, which is The Book of Boba Fett. Or whatever you're supposed to do every time somebody says Fett in that series. The Book of Boba Fett, Season 1. Book of Boba Fett Season 1 was an uneven... I don't want to say mess. It's an uneven series. We got a lot of time in flashbacks. A lot of time. Very much a Dances with Wolves kind of thing going on, where, the natives take in the individual who is from outside of the culture, and he learns their culture, and it strengthens him, and he becomes part of the tribe, and so on, and all that kind of stuff. Which I guess is interesting, but meant a lot of a lack of dialogue in many cases. And also meant that we were sort of getting the story of how he escaped the Sarlacc and then, got back to civilization that we sort of could have assumed in the background had happened without necessarily needing to see it. It also felt very much unfulfilled in the idea that there's just so many elements of it. Like, you were going to build up these characters and then just kill them all off. And he wants revenge, but he's not the one who really gets the revenge in the end. It just kind of felt like a dropped ball there. The interactions between Boba and Fennec work well, that kind of thing. The stuff in the modern era, the post-Return of the Jedi era, played out pretty well overall, except Boba didn't even get to be the star really of his own series. The best episode of Book of Boba Fett either doesn't have him in it or only has him in it for a moment because it leaps away to be an episode of The Mandalorian that winds up bringing in Ahsoka and winds up bringing in Luke and Grogu again, and so on and so on. Basically, he didn't get to be in the best episode of his own show, much if at all. I forget if he even shows up at all in that episode. I think he's like briefly in it or something. And when it came down to it, you have all these interesting plot threads going that could have made for some cool stuff in the final episode. And instead of taking the sort of mature adult route of saying, here are these story threads, we're going to make them all kind of connect and work and whatnot. In most respects, the final episode is just bang explosions. They Michael Bay'd the final episode of the series after building up these other story arcs to the point where the last episode feels like a waste, a massive missed opportunity. So for me, Book of Boba Fett Season 1 is a heavily flawed season of a show, and definitely the one that is either a miss or closest to a miss for me for any of the Disney Plus series for Star Wars thus far. So that knocks him out for number 5. That leaves us with only, 3 series? One of which has 2 seasons. So let's dive into number 4, which for me is going to be Mandalorian Season 1. Mandalorian Season 1. Mandalorian Season 1 was a cool season of that show. An interesting building up series. It really sort of felt like, you really sort of cared about the characters as you went. They spent some time to build them up. It wasn't this huge bombastic thing. It didn't feel terribly connected to the outside Star Wars universe, but it did to some degrees. And had a cool sense of peril at different points and whatnot. So, yeah, I mean, it worked. It was a smaller story. It definitely was like the space western feeling story for Mandalorian. But when you compare Season 1 to Season 2 in terms of Star Wars series, to me, Season 1 is the setup. The real payoff is Season 2, which means Season 2 would need to be ranked higher at this point. Definitely a great series and a great start-off season. It's just that it has some really stiff competition for the top 3 slots. Which brings us to number 3, which is perhaps ironic because number 3 is the most closely connected to my favorite prequel film, which is number 3, Revenge of the Sith. So no surprise based on that description. My number 3 is Obi-Wan Kenobi Season 1. And this is really a tough one between that and my number 2. Obi-Wan Kenobi was a really good series, a very emotional series. I love the fact that they kind of turned it on its head and we expected it to be like, oh, he's on Tatooine, so Luke must be involved more. But when really it was Leia that was more involved, getting a chance to see Obi-Wan doubting himself, the emotional roller coaster he must have gone through after Revenge of the Sith and how he sort of comes out the other side of it to be the watcher, to step away but be watching Luke from afar and checking in and stuff like that to keep with that mission. The introduction of the Inquisitors into that series as live action, to be able to see them. If there were 2 things that kind of kicked me out of it, one is the Grand Inquisitor. I don't think that the makeup eventually worked. I don't think the portrayal worked in relation to the Grand Inquisitor we already knew from Rebels. The death was just a fake out, of course, because we saw it in Rebels, and not really something that's explained much. It's sort of Obi-Wan television series version of somehow the Emperor returned, or somehow Palpatine returned, right? Somehow the Grand Inquisitor returned. Oh, because it was just a wound in that part of his body, so he's okay now, which makes sense in the Star Wars universe, but was kind of lame. I did actually like the character of Reva, right? The Inquisitor who essentially turns on the others and whatnot and had been there for Order 66 and was essentially building up to eventually try to take out Vader and whatnot. I did actually like the character and the way that things turned out eventually for the character. but I feel as though certain aspects of her arc were a little bit rushed. Particularly when we finally do get the revelation that she was there and everything, you know, Obi-Wan, why didn't you protect my friends, and so on. Where were you at the time of Order 66? That kind of thing. There's a moment of like sort of zipping past certain points that feels a little rushed, as does her plan. Like it looks, there's a point at which, you know, when she finally does turn on Vader, it's like, no, you're an idiot. You should know by now that that is not your opportune moment, and yet you take it anyway. All these years of planning and you blow it. So to me, there were aspects of that character that just kind of didn't quite work, even though I really did like the character in general. And there's certain things that felt sort of rushed and convenient with that. So as amazing as it was, particularly seeing Obi-Wan versus Vader, that worked really, really well. But at the same time, I was like, whew, I don't know. And of course, there's always issues that you run into with sort of, you know, what does it mean from a character motivation standpoint and relationship standpoint when we find out that they've met each other again or met each other for a first time outside of whatever. Generally speaking, I think that the Obi-Wan series worked, and I hope it is just a one-season thing. Don't milk this to the point where it becomes absurd. It works well now. Let him be on his mission there. Let the characters grow up as they need to grow up. Just kind of leave it lie. Unless you've really got some amazing stuff going for season 2, if they're going to be a season 2. I don't think they said for sure yet if there's going to be. I would also add, though, looking back at it, another thing that took me out of Obi-Wan from an effects standpoint, you get all this amazing ability to de-age actors and stuff that we see like in the Marvel stuff. They really needed to do different or better or any de-aging, I think it's any, for the flashbacks with Padawan, Anakin, and Knight Obi-Wan dueling and whatnot in the Attack of the Clones-ish era in there with those flashbacks. The flashbacks work from a storytelling standpoint, but it always kicked me out of the episode because of just how not that age both of them looked. It looked like they were cosplaying as themselves later in life or something. That brings us to my number 2, and an interesting distinction that we're going to see, I think, between 2 and 1 here. My number 2 overall for Star Wars live-action television programs is The Mandalorian Season 2. The Mandalorian Season 2 is a great ride. It's a fun ride. The Mandalorian Season 2 is a great Star Wars TV show. It feels like heavy, heavy Star Wars. It is very heavy on the continuity of things. It finally brings in, as we were expecting to probably see, it brings in more Mandalorians in the form of Bo-Katan, and other Mandalorians that were part of her Night Owls faction, you know, from back in the day. Gives us more flashbacks to tell us more about that era. We already knew the Darksaber was going to be in it, so we figured there'd be some connection there. It winds up giving us a way to bring in Ahsoka, winds up bringing in freaking Luke there at the end of Season 2. Extremely high stakes. All these different allies that have been put in place throughout the series come together as this massive team to do what needs to be done near the end. It's a great sort of build-up type thing, the way that you see a lot of Star Wars stories where you have characters building up allies that slowly but surely all those stories kind of coalesce together. And it feels very high budget, right? It very much feels like a big budget series, a big budget TV series, not necessarily like a movie, in terms of cinematography or stuff like that, but from a technology standpoint and a budget on screen type standpoint, blows everybody away when it comes to just how huge a production this was. Again, a great Star Wars series that feels very big budget movie-esque in its style. But that brings us to my number 1, and there are going to be plenty, I'm sure, who disagree with this. Hell, I would have expected to disagree with this if you had explained it to me in words what this series would be and how it would play out. But it turns out it is my favorite thus far, and that is the only one that's left. And the reason why I waited to record this until after it was over. Andor Season 1 is my number 1. The difference to me between, if I were to make a distinction here, between Andor Season 1 and Mandalorian Season 2, which to me are the two that are the strongest Star Wars television live action that we have seen thus far. There's sort of two distinctions. Mandalorian feels like, from a budget and technology standpoint, it feels like it's like a television series that's got the power of a movie, or the budget of a movie, or however you would put it. In terms of just like, again, budget, special effects, money put on screen. Andor feels like it is very cinematic. The choices of camera angles, the subtlety of taking moments with characters, it feels very cinematic and big budget in that sense. Not big budget in the sense, or cinematic in the sense of having all this money on screen as special effects, but it feels like, wow, they've really put the time and effort into this. It feels theatrical. It feels cinematic in that sense. I'm having trouble finding the right words, but I think you get what I'm trying to say here. It is also something where, as I said, you could make the argument that Mandalorian Season 2 is a great Star Wars TV series. Andor is a great TV series. Period. No need for Star Wars to be there as part of the description. Now, that does not make it, like Ewoks, Star Wars in name only. It is still very much Star Wars. It is the Empire. It is rebels or future rebels on the ground. It is focused on a character we knew from Rogue One, Cassian Andor, who, by the way, is my favorite character, and as you saw probably in that other ranking video of the films, Rogue One is my favorite current Star Wars film. But it is a much more mature, subtle, well-paced, even though it's slower paced at the beginning, but well-paced series. If this was not a Star Wars series, I think Andor would be being found in conversations like those about the middle seasons of Game of Thrones. Yeah, it doesn't have the nudity and the extreme violence in it, and the sexual content and what in it, but it is slower paced. It gives characters time to develop, time to breathe, and yet has all these characters who wind up in different places, where different aspects of their story threads must come together to give us the conclusion that propels them. Strong character development. Characters you grow to care about, even though they're not on screen a lot, because of what they do when they are on screen and what you know about them. Very much a show, don't tell type of series. And a series that, while tied to continuity and has little nods here, doesn't need a lot of fan service. Mandalorian is a great Star Wars series, and I would say that it's partly because of the fan service. Because the fan service, if you want to call it that, it's usually a pejorative thing, but fan service meant all the different cameos and all those characters coming together, which really made it feel like it was a lived-in Star Wars universe where all these different paths are crossing and everything. It was a continuity-heavy show. Andor was the opposite. Andor could focus on its lead, its other supporting characters, and how they get from point A to point B, and showed us a different side of Star Wars. Mandalorian went for sort of the Western angle, more in Season 1 than Season 2, but did lean towards sort of a Western angle. This is more of a spy thriller type of thing. You could feel the tension build. If you actually were watching these episodes, caring about these episodes, caring about the characters, and not just thinking, get to it, where's my cameos, get to it, where's my action, and watched it for a TV series as it was, watched it in the vein of something like The Sopranos, Rome, again, middle seasons and early seasons, but particularly middle seasons of Game of Thrones, after the big holy crap first season, but before the garbage latter season. If you really sat down and got into it, the tension was palpable at times, particularly with these characters whose fates we don't know. Because for the most part, Cassian's the one that we know. Except for, like, Saw, who shows up a couple of times. It felt connected, but also did its own thing, and gave us some really great characters and performances. The performances really carried it in a lot of ways. In particular, Luthen, one of the best performances, hand down, in Star Wars, alongside Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi, Sam Witwer as Maul, and so on. Absolutely mesmerizing when on screen. But I understand why some people won't enjoy the series, because to me, pacing has always been an issue. It's why The Empire Strikes Back isn't higher up on my list of Star Wars films when ranking them, because the middle section to me drags quite a bit relative to the rest of the film. For me, pacing is almost always an issue. But pacing, when done deliberately, when done to make you care, when building threads in a subtle way and not feeling like it needs to rush through everything can be excellent. And again, we saw that in various series. Now we're seeing it with Andor, that really feels like a show that, again, if it was not Star Wars, could be like from the golden age of like HBO television series, HBO original series type stuff. Is it heavy on fan service? No. No, it's not. Is it heavy on it must connect to everything spiderwebbing out? Not overly so. But between performances and the story that it tells and how gripping it was, and the fact that it's taking a more mature approach to Star Wars storytelling in terms of, show, don't tell, but also a more mature sense of, realities of war and sort of the darker side to go with it, and yet the bravery that can be instilled by seeing horrible things happen and the banality of evil and all that. It is a fantastic series. I expected to like it because of Andor. I expected that I should have disliked it because of pacing. But it was pacing, it turned out, that was slow burn, but done right and leading to something that didn't take forever to finally arrive. It all built throughout the season. And I didn't even mention, Andy Serkis's amazing performance in there as Kino Loy. It's just, yeah, hands down to me, as a 40-plus-year-old Star Wars fan who has been a fan since earliest childhood, and for whom Rogue One is his favorite Star Wars film, and Cassian Andor the favorite character in that film, I will say, just to lay it all out there, yeah, Andor Season 1 to me is the absolute best of Star Wars television productions to date. Agree or disagree, I'm sure there'll be plenty who do disagree. But that's what the comments are for, right? As always, be civil in the comments so you don't find yourself hidden from channel or otherwise booted. But how would you rank those Star Wars offerings? Again, the seasons we've seen on Disney Plus, which is just one season of Andor, one season of Obi-Wan, one season of Book of Boba Fett, and the 2 seasons of Mandalorian, and the 2 Ewok telemovies and Holiday Special. Of those 8 productions, how would you rank them? I bet some of our early stuff are going to be similar. I'm betting the latter part of the list will often be somewhat different. But we shall see. Again, if you like these rankings, you can also check out the one that I did on the non-Lego animated stuff most recently, and before that, back in, I believe, September of 2022, when I did the one on the ranking of the Star Wars theatrical films and whatnot. So, thank you for your interest. I hope this piqued some conversation, perhaps. I guess we shall see in the comments. Again, keep it civil. Disagreements are fine. That's what opinion is all about, but don't be a douche about it. And I will catch you guys the next time I pull together a ranking here. My guess is the next ranking will probably be the Lego Star Wars animated fare, but we'll see. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.